Some wars don't begin with gunfire. There are no bombs dropping, no tanks rolling into the capital, only headlines of peaceful protests, calls for freedom, and whispered promises that help is on its way. But when a foreign head of state openly urges the people of a nation to seize control of its institutions, when protesters appear with real firearms, and when sanctions, riots, and information warfare all erupt at once, this is no longer a protest. This is a game of regime change designed from the outside. In today's video, we're unpacking the entire story of Iran, who's behind it, why Iran has become a target, and what might happen if this scenario ends the same way it did in Libya or Syria. If you're interested in geopolitical analysis that's unfiltered, no sugarcoating, no propaganda, just a direct look at power, make sure to subscribe now because what's coming isn't for those who only read the headlines. There are moments in history when language itself is twisted under the weight of power. Words that once felt simple and familiar suddenly become slippery, elusive, even dangerous if taken at face value. Protest is one such word. In the popular imagination, it's the image of unarmed citizens taking to the streets to demand their rights, to raise their voices. But in modern geopolitics, protest is rarely just a spontaneous social act. It can be engineered, triggered, nurtured, and steered, like a tool in the power toolbox of major nations. What's happening in Iran forces us to pause and ask deeper questions. Not the usual ones about right or wrong, progress or backwardness, freedom or repression, but something more fundamental. Who is telling this story, and for what purpose? When international news repeats the same polished, familiar phrases over and over, it's easy to forget that media doesn't just reflect reality, it shapes it. A crowd in the streets could be the voice of the people, but it could also be the result of a long chain of external forces, where economics, information, and politics are deployed together, tightly synchronized like the gears of a single machine. Iran is not some anonymous country, nor is it a random hotspot. Every movement here is scrutinized through the lens of global interests. When a foreign leader openly urges the Iranian people to take over the institutions, when messages like "help is coming" echo at the precise moment instability spikes, and when even local sources confirm that real weapons are appearing in the hands of some demonstrators, then this is no longer a simple outburst of public frustration. It starts to take the shape of a multi-layered pressure campaign, where the streets are just the front stage and the real moves are being made behind the curtain. It's at this point that the line between protest and riot begins to blur, and once that line is erased, the story shifts into a far more dangerous phase, one where peace is no longer the central keyword, but just a linguistic shell masking a carefully orchestrated escalation. To understand why Iran is reacting the way it is and why those seemingly familiar images carry such a different meaning in this context, we must go further. We have to look directly at how an initial wave of demonstrations can evolve into a state of organized unrest, where the story can no longer be called peaceful in any simple sense of the word. In every modern political crisis, the first thing to be seized isn't the streets, it's the narrative. Before the first stone is thrown, before the first flame ignites, another battle has already begun. Quieter, but far more decisive. The battle to define reality. Who gets to be called the people? Who gets labeled as the oppressor? And somewhere in between those extremes, acts of violence are blurred by language, wrapped in seemingly harmless phrases like resistance, self-defense, or civil disobedience. In Iran, that blurry line didn't vanish overnight. At first, the gatherings were described as a natural outpouring of social frustration, but quickly, the images on the ground began to slip out of the familiar narrative frame. Government buildings were set on fire, security forces attacked, media infrastructure targeted. These were no longer symbolic acts. They were deliberate strikes aimed at undermining the state's ability to function and maintain control. Once violence enters the scene, the question is no longer, do the people have the right to protest? It becomes, who is steering this escalation? What's striking is how this shift is handled on the information front. Instead of questioning the violent nature of the events, many media outlets cling to the label peaceful protest, as if repeating it enough times will bend reality to match the words. But reality doesn't obey language. when real guns appear in the hands of demonstrators, when external voices move beyond moral support to openly urge institutional takeover, this is no longer a protest by any legal or conventional standard. It becomes a form of insurrection, staged within the context of a much larger confrontation. What exposes the pattern most clearly is the coordination. Street violence, economic pressure through sanctions, and political messaging from abroad all working in sync. None of these elements stand alone. Social discontent is amplified by economic crisis. Economic crisis is worsened by sanctions, and sanctions are then justified by the very instability they help create. It's a self-reinforcing cycle, where each step of escalation is framed as the inevitable result of the last, even as the guiding hand behind it all remains carefully hidden. For Iran, this isn't the first time they've seen this kind of story unfold, and it's precisely that historical memory that makes their response so different from what the outside world might expect. When Tehran looks at the crowds, the flames, and the way the narrative is told beyond its borders, they don't just see the present, they see the shadows of a past that never truly closed. A past where intervention was dressed up as stabilization, where regime change was called liberation, and where the fate of an entire nation was decided in closed rooms far from the people it affected. To understand why that fear still shapes Iran's strategic thinking today, we need to turn back the clock to the moment when the very first scar was carved deep into the country's political memory. The history of modern Iran didn't begin with slogans in the streets, but with a deep incision into its national sovereignty, a wound whose aftershocks still echo to this day. The year 1953 isn't just a date in textbooks. It's a collective memory that shaped how Iran sees the world, and how the world, even now, continues to try and shape Iran. When Mohammad Mossadegh was elected through one of the rare democratic processes in the Middle East at the time, he didn't represent a radical revolution, but something far more basic, the desire for control over his own nation's resources. His decision to nationalize Iran's oil wasn't an act of defiance against the global order. It was a statement that Iran would no longer accept being exploited for the benefit of others. The response made clear the real boundaries of so-called acceptable democracy. A legitimately elected government was overthrown in a carefully orchestrated covert operation, one that used money, media, and agitator groups as tools of political manipulation. Mossadegh wasn't removed because he failed his electorate, but because he stepped too far outside the orbit of the great powers. From that moment on, the message to Iranian society was unmistakable. A ballot box cannot protect your sovereignty if your choices defy the invisible hands of power. What followed only deepened that wound. The Shah's regime was installed as a stable partner, but that stability was enforced through repression, surveillance, and torture. For many Iranians, it was a period when modernization became synonymous with dependence, and when order imposed from outside came at the cost of national dignity. So when the 1979 revolution erupted, it wasn't aimed at a single man or dynasty. It targeted an entire structure of power nurtured by foreign interests. That rupture was as psychological as it was political. Iran made a decision that the price of independence, no matter how steep, was still more acceptable than the false safety of living under someone else's shadow. Since then, every internal upheaval in Iran has been viewed through the lens of past interventions. Every offer of help, every statement about protecting the people, recalls earlier promises that paved the way for stolen self-determination. This doesn't mean Iran is immune to social unrest or internal conflict. It means both the state and the people carry a historical reflex, a deep-seated wariness toward interventions cloaked in moral language. That memory has made Iran harder to bend than many other nations. And for that very reason, Iran isn't just a domestic or regional issue. When a country with a legacy of resistance to outside control sits at a key strategic crossroads, its every move carries weight beyond its borders. Born from the trauma of 1953, Iran enters the 21st century with a distinct mindset, not just to protect its regime, but to defend its right to self-determination in a global order that constantly seeks to rearrange the chessboard to its own advantage. And it's here that Iran's story stops being a story of the past and becomes an inseparable thread in the ever-shifting fabric of global power. In the eyes of many outsiders, Iran is often reduced to a stubborn Middle Eastern state, a religious flashpoint, or an ideological adversary of the West. But on the global chessboard, Iran is far more than those labels suggest. Its geographic position alone sends a strategic message. Bordering the Strait of Hormuz, through which a significant portion of the world's energy must pass, Iran doesn't just watch the flow of oil, it holds the ability to directly influence the heartbeat of the global economy. Every flare-up here sends shockwaves far beyond the region, shaking financial markets, echoing through distant capitals, and factoring into political calculations behind closed doors. But Iran's weight isn't limited to geography. For decades, Tehran has built a network of influence stretching from Iraq and Syria to Lebanon and Yemen. To its supporters, this is a defensive belt, a way to break encirclement and maintain strategic balance. To its adversaries, it's a sign of ambition and a threat that must be contained. These two interpretations constantly collide, creating a simmering zone of conflict where Iran is both an actor and a target. What truly makes Iran a global concern is its refusal to accept a subordinate role in the US-led world order. Its pivot toward Russia and China, and participation in structures like the SCO or BRICS, isn't just an economic or diplomatic move, it's a strategic statement. Iran is seeking spaces where it's not defined by sanctions or pressure from a single power center. In a world order that is fracturing, Iran's presence in these emerging alliances carries powerful symbolism, a once isolated nation actively working to reposition itself within a multipolar framework now taking shape. This makes Iran a complex challenge for the US and its allies. It can't be easily toppled through direct military intervention like in past decades, but it also can't be left alone to grow stronger. An independent Iran, with regional influence and ties to Washington's strategic rivals, runs counter to the logic of control that the US has pursued since the Cold War. And as direct military power becomes too costly and risky, the game must shift to more subtle tactics. Here's where the nature of conflict begins to change. Tanks and jets are replaced by sanction packages. Declarations of war are replaced by long-term information campaigns. And instead of clear battle lines, there's a blend of social unrest, economic pressure, and street-level instability. Given its location and role on the global board, Iran becomes the ideal target for this new style of confrontation, a type of war that needs no smoke or gunfire but can still erode a nation from within. And it's from this logic of power that we enter the next phase of the story, a new kind of war where sanctions, media narratives, and civil disorder don't operate independently, but converge like the prongs of a single long-term strategy. The wars of the 21st century rarely begin with explosions. They start in economic charts, in central bank reports, in the falling value of a currency, and in a quiet unease that seeps into everyday life. For Iran, sanctions are not some abstract diplomatic tool. They are a lived social experience. When access to global financial markets is cut off, when oil becomes difficult to sell, when international payment systems are locked down, the pressure doesn't just fall on the government. It presses directly on every household. Prices soar, jobs become unstable, medicine grows scarce, and none of that needs propaganda to breed exhaustion and anger. It is in this environment that information warfare becomes most effective. The discontent is real, the hardship is real, and those frustrations become perfect fuel for opinion-shaping campaigns. Every image is carefully selected, every personal story elevated into a symbol, every government misstep magnified into proof of a loss of legitimacy. Not all the information is false, but the way it's arranged, repeated, and amplified creates the impression that the crisis is absolute, that collapse is only a matter of time. As public sentiment is pushed to the breaking point, the streets become the next battleground. What begins as civil resistance, in a landscape choked by economic pain and guided by narrative, can quickly slide into violence. A stone thrown in anger becomes a symbol of resistance to oppression. A forceful response by security is instantly framed as evidence of systemic brutality. The cycle runs so smoothly that every escalation appears to justify the next. What's crucial is this: sanctions, media narratives, and unrest do not exist in isolation. They feed into each other. Sanctions create material hardship. Hardship fuels discontent. Discontent is amplified by information warfare. And when unrest erupts, those very images are then used to justify tightening the sanctions even further. It's a closed loop, where the victims of economic pressure are turned into evidence for the necessity of the very policies that caused their suffering. But history shows, to complete a full-scale regime change campaign, one more piece is needed. A replacement figure, a face of the future that chaos supposedly leads to. Without that figure, unrest remains mere destruction. With it, unrest is dressed up as transition. This is the stage where names in exile begin to surface, potential leaders featured prominently in the media, presented as solutions to every problem. And this is also where the memories of Libya and Syria return like a chilling warning. Once chaos has been engineered, once a figure is propped up to fill the power vacuum, the road from liberation to state collapse can be so short, no one even sees the turn before it's too late. In every modern regime change scenario, chaos is only a transitional phase. After the streets burn and slogans erupt in fury, a familiar question arises, often quietly, but always early. Who will replace the old order? Power does not tolerate a vacuum. Any campaign to topple a regime needs a face, someone to anchor the promise of a better tomorrow. It is at this point that exiled figures are brought into the spotlight, polished and presented as the natural choice, even if their ties to life inside the country have long since withered. In Iran's case, the image of a crown prince didn't surface by accident. It's a symbol that's easy to narrate and easy for Western audiences to digest. A descendant of a former order, fluent in the language of the West, promising integration, stability, openness. But the danger lies not in the individual, but in the model that figure represents. A model tested repeatedly in other lands, always wrapped in similar promises. Libya stands as the most painful example. When Gaddafi fell, the world was reassured with visions of democracy and prosperity. But what followed wasn't the rule of law. It was the complete disintegration of the state. Armed factions carved up the country, human trafficking and weapons smuggling became booming industries, and the Libyan people were left stranded in a land with no central authority strong enough to protect them. Syria, though not entirely collapsed, offers another brutal lesson: how an armed and internationalized uprising can spiral into a years-long tragedy where the word liberation drowns in blood and mass displacement. These are not distant memories for Iran. On the contrary, they are deeply embedded in Tehran's strategic thinking. When Iran sees exiled figures promoted by Western media, it doesn't just see a person, it sees a familiar sequence. Unrest, a symbolic replacement, intervention in the name of humanitarianism, and finally, the restructuring of power in someone else's favor. That's why Iran's response to such figures is not merely political, it's existential. It's the survival instinct of a state that has seen too many examples of the price of strategic naivete. What makes this chapter especially tense is the collision of two very different perspectives. For those inside Iran, the future isn't painted with promises made on international broadcasts. It's shaped by concrete memories. Memories of countries that collapsed after they were saved. And when those memories clash with the glamorous image of a replacement alternative, Iranian society is left confronting a harsh question. Will this so-called change truly bring sovereignty and stability, or will it simply open the door to yet another cycle of chaos, where the final price is, once again, paid by ordinary people? When all the layers of language are peeled away, when the flashy slogans fade into silence, one question always remains, and it's the hardest one to face. Who really pays the price? It's not the politicians speaking from afar. It's not the pundits analyzing from the comfort of studio lights, and it's certainly not the exiled figures appearing on international television. The ones who pay are always the people caught in the storm. The families struggling to survive in a suffocating economy, the young men and women pushed into the streets, angry, uncertain, and unclear about the future. In the end, Iran is not an exception. It is a sharply defined example of a world that is changing how it wages conflict. A world where wars no longer need to be declared, interventions don't require boots on the ground, and power no longer needs to occupy territory to control a nation's fate. All it takes is enough sanctions to erode daily life, enough information to steer emotions, and enough unrest to fracture public trust. And a country can be brought to the edge of collapse without a single official shot fired. The greatest danger isn't that a government might fall. It's that the very concepts of democracy and freedom are turned into tools. When change is imposed from the outside, when a people's destiny is shaped by strategic calculations that are not their own, the outcome is rarely peace or lasting stability. Libya, Syria, and many others have already paid that price. That's why the story of Iran is not just about Iran. It's a warning to any society that still believes major crises always begin with tanks and bombs. Sometimes they begin with beautiful promises, with familiar slogans, and with carefully curated images designed to stir emotion. Understanding this isn't about taking sides. It's about seeing the world more clearly, with fewer illusions and with greater responsibility toward the truth. If you have your own perspective on what's happening, share it in the comments below. Honest, level-headed discussion is one of the best defenses against being swept up in pre-written narratives. And if in-depth analyses like this help you make sense of the world's hidden dynamics, don't forget to subscribe so we can keep watching, questioning, and having the hard conversations we need in these turbulent times.